Fuck. God damn it. Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Testing one, two, three. Well, I guess it's there. Okay. Welcome. 1st of November, Weekly Marx. Marx's Economic Manuscripts of 1863, 61 to 63, the original. This is the folks' translation that's on the internet. A contribution to the critique of political economy, third chapter, Capital in general, the production process of capital. So we've been looking at the value of labor capacity. I think we got down to the beginning of the section on the valorization process. But let's go to the unity of the labor process and the valorization process, the actual production process. As I said, this is Marx's Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63, the transformation of money into capital. Noting, of course, all of the usual issues. The actual production process, which occurs as soon as money has been transformed into capital by being exchanged for living labor capacity, and ditto for the objective conditions for the realization of this capacity, the material and means of labor. This production process is a unity of the labor process and the valorization process, just as its result. The commodity, is a unity of use value and exchange value. The commodity is a unity of use value and exchange value. The production process of capital, looked at from its material side, the production of use values, is, first of all, a labor process in general. And as such, it displays the general factors which pertain to this process as such, under the most varied forms of social production. These factors are determined namely by the nature of labor as labor. Historically, in fact, at the start of its formation, we see capital take under its control, subsume under itself not only the labor process in general, but the specific actual labor processes as it finds them available in the existing technology, and in the form in which they have developed on the basis of non-capitalist relations of production. It finds in existence the actual production process, the particular mode of production, and at the beginning it only subsumes it formally, without making any changes in its specific technological character. Only in the course of its development does capital not only formally subsume the labor process, but transform it, give it the very mode of production a new shape, and thus first create the mode of production peculiar to it. But whatever its change state may be as a labor process in general, i.e. as a labor process viewed in abstraction from its historical determinateness, it always contains the general moments of the labor process as such. This formal subsumption of the labor process, the assumption of control over it by capital, consists in the worker's subjection as worker to the supervision and therefore to the command of capital or the capitalist. Capital becomes command over labor, not in the sense of Adam Smith's statement that wealth is absolutely command over labor, but in the sense that the worker as worker comes under the command of the capitalist. For as soon as he has sold his labor capacity for a definite period of time to the capitalist in return for a wage, he must enter into the labor process as a worker, as one of the factors with which capital works. If the actual labor process is the productive consumption of the use values that enter into it through labor, hence through the activity of the worker itself, it is also just as much the consumption of labor capacity by capital or the capitalist. He employs the worker's labor capacity by having him work. All the factors of the labor process, the material of labor, the means of labor, living labor itself, as the activity, the consumption of the labor capacity is bought, belong to him. So the whole labor process belongs to him just as much as if he were working with his own material and his own means of labor. But since labor is at the same time the expression of the worker's own life, the manifestation of his own personal skill and capacity, a manifestation which depends on his will and is simultaneously an expression of his will, the capitalist supervises the worker, controls the functioning of labor capacity as an action belonging to him. He will make sure that the material of labor is used for the right purpose, that is, consumed as material of labor. If any material is wasted, it does not enter into the labor process, is not consumed as material of labor. The same is true of the means of labor, when, of course, the worker wears out their own material substance in a manner other than that prescribed by the labor process itself. Lastly, the capitalist will make sure that the worker really works the whole time required and expends necessary labor time only, i.e., does the normal quantity of work over a given time. In all these aspects, the labor process and thereby labor and the worker himself come under the control of capital, under its command. I call this the formal subsumption of the labor process under capital. In the whole of the following investigation, the labor of the capitalist itself may perhaps perform, that the labor the capitalist may himself perform is never reckoned among the components of the product's value. This is, PMC, for example. If it consists of simple labor, it has nothing to do with the relation as such, and the capitalist is not working as capitalist, as near personification capital incarnate. If, however, it is a form of labor that arises from the particular functions of capital as such, hence from the capitalist mode of production as such, we shall subject it later on to a more specific and precise examination as labor of superintendence. That is super, INTENDENCE. This formal subsumption of the labor process under capital or the command of the capitalist over the worker has nothing in common with, for example, the relation that prevailed in the guild industry of the Middle Ages between the master and the journeyman and apprentices. It emerges instead simply and purely from the fact that productive consumption or the production process is at the same time a process of the consumption of labor capacity by capital, that the content and determining purpose of this consumption is nothing but the preservation and increase of the value of capital, and this preservation and increase can only be attained by the most effective, most exact organization of the actual labor process, which depends on the will, the hard work, etc., of the worker, and which therefore is taken under the control and supervision of the capitalist's will. One more remark with reference to the production process. Money, in order to be transformed into capital, must be transformed into the factors of the labor process, i.e., into commodities which can figure as use values in the labor process. Hence, it must be transformed into means of consumption for labor capacity, i.e., the worker's means of subsistence, or into the material and means of labor. All commodities, therefore, or all products which cannot be employed in the manner or are not destined to be thus employed, belong to the consumption fund of society. but not to capital. Here we understand under capital the objects wherein capital exists. Nevertheless, as long as these products remain commodities, they are themselves mode of existence of capital. If capitalist production is presupposed, capital produces all products without exception. It's entirely irrelevant whether these products are destined for productive consumption or are unable to enter into it, unable therefore to become the body of capital again. But they then remain capital as long as they remain commodities, i.e., are present in circulation. As soon as they are definitively sold, they cease to be capital in this sense. To the extent that capital is not at the stage of the labor process, it must absolutely be on hand in the form of commodity or money, if only perhaps a mere claim on money, etc., but they cannot enter into the labor process or the production process use values. In the same measure as the worker is active as a worker, i.e., externalizes his labor capacity, he alienates it, since it's already been alienated by sale as a self-externalizing capacity to the money owner before the labor process begins. As labor realizes itself on the one hand as the form of raw material, as use value and product, and on the other hand, as exchange value, objectified social labor in general, it is transformed into capital. In general, to say that capital is a product employed as a means for new production is, as already remarked above, to misconstrue the capital relation as covering the objective conditions of every labor process. On the other hand, the same confusion may arise, and is even to be found in part in Ricardo himself, when capital is described as accumulated labor employed for the production of more accumulated labor. The expression is ambiguous, since one needs to understand no more by accumulated labor than the products which are employed for the production of new use values. But the expression can also be understood in the sense that the product as exchange value is in general nothing more than a definite quantity of objectified labor expended in order to make this quantity grow. Hence the process of self-valorization. Although the second process presupposes the first process, in contrast, does not necessarily imply the second. To the extent that the objective conditions of labor, the material and means of labor, serve directly in the labor process, they're employed by the worker. But it is not labor which employs capital. It is only capital which employs labor. It is the specific position taken up by value in general towards labor capacity by objectified past labor towards living present labor, by the conditions of labor towards labor itself, which forms the specific nature of capital. We shall go into this in somewhat more detail at the end of section 1, that is, the transformation of money into capital. Here, it suffices to say, for the moment, that in the production process, insofar as this is a valorization process and hence a process of the self-valorization of the preposited value or money value, i.e. the objectified general social labor, past labor preserves and increases itself, posits surplus value through exchange to the relative appropriation of living labor, and exchange mediated by the purchase of labor capacity. It thus appears as value in process and preserving and maintaining itself in the process. It thus appears as a self. And the incarnation of this self is the capitalist, the selfhood of value. Living labor appears only as the means, the agency through which capital, that is value, reproduces and increases itself. Labor is the agency by which capital is made productive of wages, labor, or revenue. It's John Wade, 1835. In the abstract economic section of his book, Wade has some original points for his time, for example, on commercial crises, etc. The whole of the historical part is, in contrast, a striking example of the shameless plagiarism that predominates among the English economists. It is, in fact, copied almost word for word from Sir F. Morton Eden, The State of the Poor, etc., in 3 volumes, 1797. So much for intellectual property. Anyway, value, objectified labor, acquires this relation to living labor only to the extent that it is confronted by labor capacity as such, i.e., to the extent that conversely, the objective conditions of labor, and hence the conditions for the realization of labor capacity, confront labor capacity itself in separation and independence under the control of an alien will. Hence, although the means and material of labor are not as such capital, they themselves appear as capital because their independence, their existence as entities in their own right vis-a-vis the worker, and therefore labor itself, is rooted in their being. Just as gold and silver appear as money and are notionally directly connected with the social relation of production, of which they are the vehicles. Within capitalist production, the relationship between the labor process and the valorization process is that the latter appears as the purpose, the former only as the means. The former is therefore stopped when the latter, that is valorization, is no longer possible or not yet possible. On the other hand, it is revealed in times of so-called speculative fashions, of crises of speculation, stock shares and so forth, that the labor process, the actual material process, is only a burdensome requirement, and the capitalist nations are seized by a universal mania for attaining the goal, that is the valorization process, without them using the means. The labor process as such could only provide its own purpose if the capitalist were concerned with the use value of the product. He is, however, only concerned with alienating it by sale as a commodity, converting it back into money, and, since it was money originally, with the increase of this sum of money. In this sense, it can be said, quote, the value makes the product, as J.B. say. In brackets, this is in fact true for all production of commodities. On the other hand, it's also correct that only capitalist production is commodity production to the broadest extent, i.e., production for the individual's own use entirely disappears. And the elements of production, even in agriculture, are to a greater and greater degree already commodities when they enter the production process. Here, in dealing with the transformation of money into capital, we need only to point out generally to the form in which money appears, since we're going to return to this in dealing with circulation. In any case, this has already been done for the most part. For example, in 1, that is 1A, the most general form of capital. A further remark needs to be made with regard to the valorization process. Is not merely value, but a sum of value that is preposited to it. A value of a definite magnitude, a point which will be developed still further later on. It must, even as capitalist in nuce, must be capable of buying one worker and the material and instrument needed for him. In short, the sum of value is here determined from the outset by the exchange values of the commodities which enter directly into the labor process. We therefore call the whole thing the capitalist production process on the basis of capital. It is not a question of producing a product, but a commodity, a product destined to be sold. And it is not a question of simply producing commodities in order, by selling them, to gain possession in this way of the use values available in circulation, but of producing commodities in order to preserve and increase the preposited value. So, if the labor process is viewed directly, abstractly, it can be said that originally only 2 factors come into play. That is, man and nature, labor and the material, the natural material of labor. His first tools are his own limbs, and even this Even these he must first appropriate for himself. Only with the first product that is employed for new production, even if it is just a stone thrown at an animal to kill it, does the labor process proper begin. One of the first tools appropriated by man is the animal, that is, the domesticated animal. See on this point the passage in Turgot. To this extent, from the point of view of labor, Franklin is right to define man as a tool-making animal or engineer. The earth and labor would then be the original factors of production. The products destined for labor, produced material of labor, means of subsistence, would only be derivative factors. The earth and labor would then be the original factors of production. Quote, the earth is necessary, capital is useful, and labor with the earth produces capital. This is Collins' Political Economy, Sources of the Revolution of Utopian Socialism. Collins believes that this achievement of independence by value, which is contained in the concept of capital, was invented by the economists. The above-mentioned ambiguity is also present in James Mill. Quote, all capital, here capital in the merely material sense, consists really in commodities. The first capital must have been the result of pure labor. The first commodities could not be made by any commodities existing before them. James Mill, 1821. However, this separation of production into the factors man as vehicles of labor and earth, actually nature, as object of labor is also totally abstract. The separation of production into these factors is totally abstract. For man does not originally confront nature as a worker, but as a proprietor. And it is not man as a solitary individual, but man as a member of a tribe, a clan, a family, etc., as soon as one can at all speak of a man leading a human existence. In the same Mill, quote, labor and capital, the one immediate labor, the other hoarded labor, that which has been the result of former labor, close quote. If, on the one hand, capital is reduced in the labor process to its merely material mode of existence, if it is separated into its factors in order, in general, to smuggle it in as a necessary element of all production, it is, on the other hand, also conceded that capital is of a purely notional nature because it is value, as J.B. Sayce, as Mondi, etc. If it is said that capital is a product, as opposed to a commodity, as Proudhon and Whalen suggest, or that it is the instrument of labor and the material of labor, or that it consists of the product the worker receives, etc., it is forgotten that in the labor process, labor has already been incorporated into capital and belongs to it just as much as the means and material of labor. When the laborers receive wages for their labor, this is Mill, the capitalist is the owner, not of the capital only in this material sense, but of the labor also. If what is paid as wages is included, as it commonly is in the term capital, it is absurd to talk of labor separately from capital. The word capital, as thus employed, includes labor and capital both, James Mill. Just as it is convenient for the apologists of capital to confuse it with the use value in which it exists and to call use value as such capital, in order to present capital as an external factor of production, as a relation independent of all social forms, immanent in every labor process, hence immanent in the labor process in general, so equally does it happen that it suits Monsieur, the economist, when reasoning away some of the phenomena which belong peculiarly to the capitalist mode of production, to forget the essential feature of capital, namely that it is value positing itself as value, hence not only self-preserving, but at the same time self-multiplying value. Now, this is convenient, for example, for proving the impossibility of overproduction. The capitalist is here conceived as someone who's only concerned with the consumption of certain products, their appropriation by means of the sale of his commodity, not with the increase of the preposited value purchasing power as such, abstract wealth as such. Through the transformation of money into capital effected by the exchange of money with labor, the general formula for capital M-C-M, all capitals, capital C, capital C, capital M, capital C, capital M, has now acquired a content. Money is the independent existence of exchange value. Viewed from the angle of its quality, it is the material representative of abstract wealth, the material existence of abstract wealth. But the degree to which it is this, the extent to which it corresponds to its concept, depends on its own quantity or mass. In the increase of money corresponds to the increase of value as such. This increase is an end in itself. To make money by means of money is the purpose of the capitalist production process, the increase of wealth in its general form of the quantity of objectified social labor, which is, as this labor, expressed in money. Now, whether the existing values figure merely as money of account in the ledger or in whatever other form as tokens of value, etc., is initially a matter of indifference. Money appears here only as the form of independent value which capital assumes at its starting point as also at its point of return, but constantly abandons again. Now, a more detailed treatment of this belongs in section 2, book 2, volume 2, the circulation process of capital. Capital is here money in process, for which its forms as money and commodity are themselves merely alternating forms. It is continuously estimated in money of account and is only valid as this money's material existence, even as long as it exists as a commodity. And no sooner does it assume the form of money than it must, in order to valorize itself, abandon that form again. To say the capitalist is concerned with money is to say nothing but that he is concerned purely with exchange value, with the increase of exchange value, with abstract enrichment. But this is solely expressed as such in money. Quote, this is Chalmers, the great object of the moneyed capitalist, in fact, is to add to the nominal amount of his fortune. It is that if expressed pecuniarily this year by 20,000, for example, it should be expressed pecuniarily next year by 24,000. To advance his capital as estimated in money is the only way in which he can advance his interest as a merchant. The importance of this object to him is not affected by fluctuations in the currency or by a change in the real value of money. For example, he may have advanced his fortune by the business of 1 year from 20,000 to 24,000, and that from a decline in the value of money, he may not have increased his command over the comfort still. Still, it was as much his interest to have engaged in the business as if money had not fallen. For else, his moneyed fortune would have remained stationary. His real wealth would have declined to the proportion of 20 over 20, 24 over 20. Commodities, etc., are therefore not the terminating object of the trading capitalist, save in the spending of his revenue, and when he purchases for the sake of consumption, in the outlay of his capital, and when he purchases for the sake of production, money is his terminating object. Chalmers quotes, quote, 1832. Another point in relation to the formula M-C-M, value as capital, self-valorizing value, is value raised to a second power. Not only does it have an independent expression, as in money, but it compares itself with itself, or is compared by the capitalist or it is compared by the capitalist, and therefore measures itself at one period, the magnitude of value in which it was preposited to the production process against itself in another period, Department 2, namely after its return from circulation, after the commodity has been sold and reconverted into money. Value, therefore, appears as the same subject in two different periods. And indeed, this is its own movement, the movement that characterizes capital. Only in this movement does value appear as capital. See, in opposition to this, Bailey's A Critical Dissertation on the Nature, Measures, and Causes of Value, chiefly in reference to the writings of Mr. Ricardo and his followers of 1825. Now, Bailey's main argument against the whole determination of value by labor time is this: that is, value is only the relation according to which different commodities are exchanged. Value is only a relation between two commodities. Now, only, interesting question. Quote, value is nothing intrinsic or absolute. It is impossible to designate or express the value of commodity except by a quantity of some other commodity. Hence Rafa, right? Instead of regarding value as a relation between two objects, they, the Ricardians and Ricardo himself, consider it as a positive result produced by a definite quantity of labor. Because the values of A and the value of A and the value of B, according to their doctrine, are to each other as the quantities of producing labor, or are determined by the quantities of producing labor, they appear to have concluded that the value of A alone, without reference to anything else, is as the quantity of its producing labor. There is no meaning, certainly, in that last proposition. They speak of value as a sort of general and independent property. The value of a commodity must be its value in something. Close quote. Now, an objectification of social labor, the commodity, as objectification of social labor, the commodity is expressed as something relative. For if the labor contained in A is equated to all others, this is only as a particular form of existence of social labor. In this, however, the individual is already not viewed in isolation, but if Bailey wishes it, his labor is posited relatively, and the commodity is itself posited as the mode of existence, as a form of existence of this relative thing. The same Bailey says, quote, value is a relation between contemporary commodities because such only admit of being exchanged for each other, and if we compare the value of a commodity at one time with its value at another, it is only a comparison of the relation in which it stood at these different times to some other commodity, close quote. Now, Bailey says this as an argument against comparing commodities at different periods, as if, for example, in the turnover of capital, the capitalist had not continuously to compare the value of one period to the value of another period. Now, it could be asked, what is the relationship in which capital's monetary expression stands to capital itself? Once money exists in the form of money, the constituent elements for which it is exchanged in its transformation into productive capital confront it as commodities. Here, therefore, the laws developed in the metamorphosis of the commodity or in the simple turnover of money are valid. If tokens of value circulate, whether they serve as means of circulation or means of payment, they merely represent the value of the commodities estimated in money, or they directly represent money, which is equal in quantity to the amount of money expressed in the prices of the commodities. As such, they have no value. They are therefore not yet capital in the sense that the latter is objectified labor. They represent instead, in full, the price of the capital, as they previously represented that of the commodity. If real money circulates, This is itself objectified labor dash capital because of this commodity relation. Now, if we divide the total sum of money turning over by the number of times it turns over, we get the quantity of money really engaged in the process of turning over. And this is a constituent element of the capital, fixed or circulating according to the view one wishes to take of it. I can buy commodities for $120 with the same $6 if they turn over 20 times in a day. They represent the value of $120 in the course of a day. But the $6 themselves must be added to this. So the whole amount of capital turning over in the course of the day equals $126. If a capital equals $100 and it buys commodities with those $100, then the same $100 now represent a second capital of $100 and so on. If they turn over 6 times in the day, they've successfully represented a capital of $600. Now, how much or how little capital they represent on a given day, therefore, depends on their velocity of turnover, the speed of the commodities metamorphosis, which appears here as the metamorphosis of capital, alternately assuming and abandoning its forms of money and commodity. If the money functions as a means of payment, $600 of money can pay for any amount of capital since its negative and positive changes cancel out, leaving a balance of what? $600. Whereas originally, in the simple circulation of money appears as a point of transition. The metamorphosis of the commodity, that is, the commodity transformed into money, appears as the point of departure and conclusion of the moment of capital, and the commodity appears as metamorphosis of capital as a mere point of transition. The only distinguishing marks of money, insofar as it appears as a form of capital, as real money, not as money of account, are these. Number one, it returns to its point of departure and an increased quantity. Money expended for consumption does not return to its point of departure. Capital, that is money advanced for the purpose of production, returns in increased quantity to its point of departure. Number two, money which has been expended remains in circulation from which it withdraws the commodity. Capital throws back into circulation more commodities than it withdrew, and it therefore also constantly withdraws anew from circulation the money it has expended. The more rapid this cyclic movement, i.e., the more rapid the circulation of metamorphosis of capital, the more rapid the turnover of money. And since this movement of capital is many-sided, the more does money serve as means of payment, and the more do debts and assets balance each other. Capital transformed into money in the way we have described becomes productive capital insofar as it has subsumed the production process, functions as buyer and employer of labor. Only where capital has subjected production itself to its control, hence where the capitalist produces, does capital exist as the dominant specific form of a period of production. Now, formally speaking, it may already have emerged previously in other functions, and it appears in these functions in its own period too. But then, these are only derivative and secondary forms of capital, such as commercial and interest-bearing capital, etc. So when we speak of productive capital, the whole of this relation is to be understood not as if one of the forms of use value in which it appears in the labor process were itself productive, with the machine or the material of labor producing value, etc. From the valorization process, whose result is the value advanced and a surplus value in the labor process itself. Capital appears as a real use value, i.e. as real consumption, for only in consumption is use value realized as use value. This process of the consumption of capital itself forms an economic relation, has a definite economic form, and is not indifferent, falling outside the norm, as in the concept of the mere commodity, these use values, of which capital consists, are conceptually determined by the activity of labor capacity. The activity of labor capacity, which consumes them. It follows that the actual specific product of capital, insofar as it produces as capital, is surplus value itself. And that in production by capital, the specific product of labor, so far as capital incorporates labor, is not this or that product, but capital. The labor process itself appears only as the means of the valorization process. Just as in general, use value appears here as only the repository of exchange value. So we get to the end a little early. What we've been looking at here is the subsection unity of the labor process and the valorization process. And I hope you can see how valorization is something slightly different, and it allows us to see both the labor capacity in the abstract and value, the production of value, as both things that are determined, overdetermined even by capital, that capital is a kind of transformation in a direction. And whether it's positive or negative is a wholly different question. But the reality is that a movement is occurring, and that's pretty important. I mean, it's not static in that sense. It is always, and even in a comparative way, it implies a dynamic element that is life itself. For we are, if but nothing, static if we're dead. Anyway, enough of that. So I'm going to shut